Okay, guys, in this video, we're going to be talking about some of the other classical conditioning components that are important for you to know, and we'll also get into whether or not humans can be conditioned in the classical conditioning sense. This video will take us all the way up and wrap up our notes on classical conditioning, so it's important that you follow along. And depending on our weather situation, we will either continue with video notes for the time being, or we'll just get back to it in class. Um, so you should have familiarity with unconditioned stimuli, unconditioned responses, conditioned stimulus, conditioned response. We talked about acquisition, right, which is the process of acquiring a new conditioned stimulus. So that is a neutral stimulus, or what starts out as a neutral stimulus gets paired with an unconditioned stimulus, right? So in Pavlov's example, bell is neutral. The ringing of the bell is a neutral stimulus. When that's paired with presenting food, that then leads the bell to be a conditioned stimulus, right? That bell is signaling the arrival of food. So let's talk about the other end. How does this go away? So there's something called extinction, and that is, I believe we talked about this in class, but this is when classical conditioning gets broken. So in other words, it is when the bell loses its meaning in Pavlov's dog. So if we take a look at this animation here together, right, you'll see that initially the bell produces a pretty, high um, uh, amount of, in this case, saliva, right? That it's producing a conditioned response pretty severely, and you also see kind of how it like zigzags towards the bottom. It's a pretty steep drop, and then it kind of like bounces up and down a little bit at the end. That's pretty common, right? We think that that's mostly because the animal's kind of thinking, although reflexively thinking, like, oh, is it? No, it's not going to happen. Is it this time? Is it going to be food? No, not this time. It's kind of, for lack of a better word, optimistic, hopeful message that the bell is going to signal food again, like it had before. Now, there's also something called spontaneous recovery, which is where after, some time after extinction, where the conditioned stimulus is no longer a conditioned stimulus, it's moved back to a neutral stimulus. That if you ring the bell again, sometimes you'll see a spike in the conditioned response. So this is kind of like we don't really know why this happens. We don't know the mechanisms behind this. We just know that it works, or that it happens, I should say, not necessarily that it works. And that's called spontaneous recovery, right? Spontaneous meaning it happens randomly. And it's not just that, even though that slide said 24 hours, it's something that can happen weeks, months, even years after the fact. It can just suddenly come back and trigger the response. Let's talk about another type of conditioning, which is kind of different than what we're normally thinking of. There's something called conditioned inhibition, which is basically that a conditioned stimulus, an animal can learn that a conditioned stimulus predicts the absence of an unconditioned stimulus, right? So basically, what's happening in this picture is those zebras are very close to that lion, but they know that that lion had just hunted and had just eaten. Therefore, it is unlikely to go after any of the individual zebras that are in this photo. They have learned, right, through classical conditioning, that after a lion eats, it is no longer a threat. Therefore, this conditioned learning inhibits the threat response, right? It inhibits the fact that they're going to see the lion as a predator and not just another animal out on the savannah. So you can be conditioned to not have unconditioned stimulus and responses. Another thing we should talk about, vocab term wise, is generalization. So initially, one of the other experiments that Pavlov did was he wanted to see if he could get the dog to salivate at the presentation of a little like vibrating machine, like a little toy that would shake back and forth. And he would place that around the dog's body, and when the thing would shake, it would then signal food, right? So he paired that, right? The shaking leads to food, which then leads to the salivation, the conditioned response. At first, Pavlov kept the vibrating thing on the thigh, but as he moved it around the body, the dog's body, it still produced saliva. So that's what we call generalization, right? That basically it doesn't have to be very specific. It's just anything. The dog basically generalized the vibrating motion on the thigh to vibrating motion anywhere on the body. That is what we call generalization. Now, the opposite of generalization is also true, which is what we call discrimination, which is where the animal discriminates between two similar sounding possible conditioned stimuli. So imagine that instead of just one bell, Pavlov had two bells, one that had a high pitched tone and one that had a low pitched tone. And at first, while only using, say, the high pitched tone, the dog would still salivate with the presence of the lower tone, right? Almost just as frequently, right? If you look at this graph here, the blocks of trials, right? That it's pretty even up until really set, system 12 or 13, where you start to see this divide. And that divide is when the dog learns that there's a difference between the two tones, and only the high pitched tone signals the arrival of food. So that's what we call discrimination. So at first, that kind of conjoined rise, or what we might call a positive correlation, right, starts with it's generalization, right? The dog's generalizing all tones to signal the arrival of food. But as time goes on, it learns to discriminate between the high tone and the low tone, thus basically ignoring the low tone almost completely, while then responding very highly to the high-pitched tone. Okay, so that's what we call discrimination. So that's why, for example, I've used this before, why my dogs know the sound of the peanut butter jar opening as opposed to every other jar that we have, because sometimes when we open the peanut butter jar, they get a treat. So that's the main terms here for Pavlov and classical conditioning. We should talk about the work of a very famous psychologist by the name of John Watson. John Watson decided to build on Pavlov's work. He was a contemporary of him. He did most of his work in the early 1920s. And he's considered one of the founders of the behaviorism school in psychology. Watson wanted to know if humans could be classically conditioned, and specifically, could we be conditioned to fear things? Watson wanted to know if this is how we learn to associate animals that we don't like, or other fearful thoughts that we might have. So he set out a pretty infamous experiment, which we call the Little Albert experiment. Excuse me. The Little Albert experiment was basically Watson and his colleague Rosalie Rayner trying to condition fear into an infant regarding white rats. So at first, and as you'll see in the video that I'm posting to Schoology, which you should watch, we'll watch it and then we'll talk about it in class. You can see that at first the baby is unafraid of the white rat, or in fact of any of the animals that are brought before it. But then the conditioning happens, which is every time a white rat shows up, which, remember, at first is a neutral stimulus, right? The baby's not afraid of the white rat. Watson strikes a metal bar with a hammer behind the baby so that the baby learns to associate the loud noise, which of course startles the baby, and associating it with the white rat. Over time, after repeated pairings, right, the baby is associating the white rat as a conditioned stimulus for fear, right? It starts responding as if the white rat is causing fear. Now we see that in Little Albert in the experiments. This is actually an image from that famous experiment, which is the video that I have that's posted. So what happens over time, of course, is that Little Albert becomes afraid of the white rat, but he also becomes afraid of almost all things furry, fluffy, white, whether that's a teddy bear, a rabbit, or Watson himself wearing the creepiest mask of all time. You can see all that in the video where Albert, Little Albert expands he generalizes, right, to use our terms, to that fear to all furry things as opposed to just the white rat. There's a lot that has been written over the years about little Albert. There's very little known about um, what happened to little Albert after the fact. There's shady circumstances around his participation in this. He was said to have been the child of someone who worked with Rosalie Rayner, who kind of needed the money, and might have been coerced into letting her son be part of this study. The one thing we do know is the fact that little Albert was never, I guess, for lack of a better word, I don't want to say debriefed, but he never had this conditioning removed, right? This conditioned stimulus was never extinguished. And if you can imagine fear as an emotion, right, that's not something that necessarily goes away on its own. It has this kind of insidious way of doubling down, which we'll talk more about when we get into operant conditioning for sure. But it's still an important thing for you guys to realize that this was a very unethical experiment. It's famous, right? It's what actually called the Little Albert experiment. And every now and then there's like new stories that come out about, what happened to little Albert or Rosalie Rayner or Watson. We know what happened. He actually left psychology and started an advertising business using the principles of classical conditioning to, sell products and stuff. So definitely a very interesting guy. Interesting, I think, is the nicest way I could put it. He is infamous for sure in the field of psychology, but he is foundational to the school of behaviorism in psychology. So he's an important name that we need to know. Okay, the last thing I really need to get into some of the details on here regarding classical conditioning is something that I've mentioned in class, and that's higher order conditioning. Okay, so higher order conditioning is basically what is an example of, well, actually, it's not an example of it. It's a way that you can have a conditioned response not paired to an unconditioned stimulus. Yes. As you can see, the alphabet soup here can be a little challenging, right? CR, UCR, UCS, that kind of stuff. But that's called higher order conditioning. So, as opposed to generalization, right, which is where it was never conditioned in the first place, but the subject kind of expands the criteria, I guess, for something that would be considered a conditioned stimulus. Here you have an extra neutral stimulus added. So we can start again, traditional Pavlov, bell, then food, bell, then food, bell, then food. That leads to the drool. But then if we institute a light and do a light and then a bell, right, that's then signals the drooling, right, because now the bell is a conditioned stimulus. And over time, the light itself will also produce the drooling. Each time you do this, the conditioned response gets weaker and weaker unless it is still sometimes paired with an unconditioned stimulus, unless every now and then the plate of the steak shows up for the dog to eat. But this also explains how animals learn to associate things beyond the immediate biological needs or immediate reflexes like salivation or pupil dilation or those other kinds of things. That there can be this higher order, right? That it just starts building on itself. And you can imagine that over time, right, you can have like a string of these that then, leads to, totally different changes in behavior, and maybe in a way that eludes the consciousness of the subject being studied or being conditioned. So that's pretty much classical conditioning. We should talk a little bit about the applications of this because they're not as broad as you might think. One of the things to always keep in mind here when we're talking about classical conditioning is that it has to be on automatic responses, right? It has to be a neutral stimulus, so something that is that doesn't provoke any sort of response, that's paired with something that you don't need to learn. So, right, like the classic example of the meat and the saliva, right? You don't need to learn that when you are hungry or when you're eating that you produce saliva. That's not something that you ever had to learn. Your body just does it naturally. So the same thing applies with all other classical conditioning. It can really only be used for things that are automatic, right? That you don't need to learn in the first place. So its scope is actually pretty limited. Even the examples I've been giving of, my dogs running into the kitchen when they hear the peanut butter jar, that's technically not classical conditioning. Now, drooling at the sound of the peanut butter jar, which of course they do, is classical conditioning, but them coming into the kitchen is not. That's something that's different that we'll talk about later. It's operant conditioning. So, what are the applications of classical conditioning? Well, one of the most successful ways that classical conditioning is used is actually in treating alcoholism. There's some drugs that you can put in alcohol that makes the person violently ill just with one sip. So alcoholics have been sometimes treated for their alcoholism by the psychiatrist prescribing these drops that are then put in the booze of the alcoholic, therefore breaking that association of the positivity that alcoholics feel when they drink, to associating the drink with feeling lousy, with feeling sick. That does work. Obviously, there are limits to that, which we'll actually get into when we look at conditioning as a whole. But that is a pretty solid application of classical conditioning. Another way, which kind of is explained away with the placebo effect, but if you've ever had a headache and you take, Advil or Tylenol or something, and within a few minute or two, your headache goes away, that's kind of classical conditioning, that your body has associated the taste of the pill, or just even the act of taking a pill, with an increased immune response, which then, solves the problem with the headache. So that is another example of classical conditioning. Now, certainly, we're not going to rely on that in terms of medicine, right? That's why we don't give out placebos to sick people. We give them actual medicine, but there is that response that happens through classical conditioning. Again, notice that these are both unlearned things, right? You can't force your immune system to respond more strongly, right? It's just something that happens or it doesn't. So that's classical conditioning. Knowing the component parts of classical conditioning is really important. So those exercises that you did for homework are going to be really, really vital. If you got a lot wrong, if when we're reviewing it seems like there's a lot, let me know. I'm going to be you're going to have more of them to do. But it's an important practice to get, because there are certainly going to be questions both on our test and on the AP exam about identifying, the conditioned stimulus or the unconditioned response, or those kinds of things. So you really, really need to know those. All right. So the next time we take notes, whether that's virtually or in person, we'll be talking about operant conditioning. So stay tuned for that. Until then, see you guys.